By the time August arrives, many gardeners make the same mistake I used to make for years. We pull out the cucumbers, peas, beans, or early potatoes, look at the empty bed, and decide that the garden is finished until spring. That empty ground may look harmless, but it can quietly cost you another harvest of fresh food before winter. I have learned that August is not the month when the garden has to stop producing. It can be the month when one harvest turns into another. I remember looking at a bed after the last early potatoes came out and thinking there was nothing worth planting because summer was already getting away from me. Then an older gardener I knew showed me what he did every year. He cleared the old crop, loosened only the top of the soil, made a shallow furrow, filled that furrow with water, and planted again. A few weeks later, while other beds were becoming empty, his garden was giving him fresh spinach, radishes, lettuce, and other greens. That changed the way I looked at August. The important thing was not some expensive fertilizer or a special product from a garden center. The simple part was knowing what could still grow and getting moisture into the soil at the right time. This matters because August sowing is different from spring sowing. The soil may be warm and dry, and a small seed can fail simply because the moisture disappears before the seed has properly started. I have lost plenty of late rows that way myself. I would sow carefully, cover the seeds, water once, and then wonder why almost nothing came up. Later, I realized that the seed was not always the problem. The ground was. So in this video, I want to show you how I use those empty August beds for a second harvest, which crops I would choose, how I prepare the furrow before sowing, and why I now make several small sowings instead of putting everything in the ground on one day. There is also one very simple watering habit that has saved more late summer plantings for me than anything else, and most gardeners skip it because it looks almost too ordinary to matter. One reason August sowing fails for so many people is that they treat it like spring sowing, when the conditions are completely different. In spring, the soil is often naturally moist, the days are getting longer, and a small seed has more time to get established before the weather changes. In August, the ground can be warm and dry, and even when rain comes, it may not stay where your seeds need it. I have watched people make a neat row, scatter the seeds, cover them, water once, and then walk away thinking the job is finished. A few days later, they come back and see almost nothing. They blame the seed, blame the weather, or decide that August is simply too late. But very often the real problem started before the seed ever went into the ground. I learned this the hard way after losing more than one late row because I treated the bed as if I were planting in April. The old summer crop had left the soil warm, but the surface was drying quickly. A small seed needs steady moisture while it is getting started, and a single watering on top of dry ground may not be enough. This is why I stopped thinking of watering as something I do after sowing. For late crops, watering is part of sowing itself. I clear away the old cucumber vines, pea plants, bean stems, or potato remains, remove the larger roots, and loosen only the top layer of soil. I do not spend half the day digging a bed that has already been growing food all summer. Then I make a shallow furrow and slowly fill it with water. I let that water disappear into the soil before I place the seeds there. If the ground is especially dry, I give the furrow another drink rather than rushing the job. That small change has made my August sowings much more reliable. There is another mistake that I stopped making at the same time. I no longer sow the whole packet in one go just because the bed is empty. I would rather put in a short row of spinach this week, another small row about a week later, and then perhaps some lettuce or radishes after that. If one sowing struggles because of a hot spell, I still have another one coming. More importantly, the harvest does not arrive all at once. It comes in smaller amounts that I can actually use. I used to think the old gardeners who kept sowing in August were simply refusing to admit that summer was ending. Now I understand that they were doing something much more practical. They were using the warm soil while it was still there and giving autumn crops a head start before the nights became cool. I remember one older neighbor who never seemed to have an empty bed for long. When his cucumbers finished, he cleared them away and planted again. When the early potatoes came out, he did not cover the ground and wait for spring. He put another crop there. At first, I thought all that extra work must make his garden much harder to manage. But when I watched him through September, I noticed something different. His garden was not harder to manage at all. He simply changed what he expected from it. He was no longer asking the summer crops to keep producing after their best days were gone. He was giving the garden a new job. One of the first crops he taught me to sow in August was spinach. I'd always associated spinach with spring, but that can be a frustrating time for it because warm weather arrives quickly and the plants can become less useful before you get much from them. Late summer gives spinach a different chance. The soil is still warm enough to help the seeds start, while the cooler nights that come later can give the leaves a better texture and a milder taste. I make a small row, loosen the surface, water the furrow first, and then sow the seeds lightly. I learned not to bury them too deeply because small seeds have a much easier time emerging when they are covered gently. Then I leave enough room for the young plants instead of throwing the whole packet into one narrow row. The same thinking works beautifully with radishes. An older gardener once told me that a radish planted for autumn can be a very different vegetable from one grown through the hottest part of summer. I did not believe him until I tried it. The roots can stay crisp and juicy as the weather cools, and because they grow quickly, they are one of the easiest ways to turn an empty August bed into useful food. But there is another crop that fits this old method even better because it lets you keep taking small harvests instead of clearing everything at once, and that is where the idea of sowing a little every week becomes really valuable. The crop I want you to pay special attention to in August is spinach, but I do not want you to stop there because this is where the old method becomes useful for almost any small late-season sowing. Once the old summer crop is out, I clear the bed without trying to make it perfect. I remove the large plant remains, pull out the obvious weeds, and loosen the surface just enough to make a clean place for the new seeds. Then I make a shallow furrow, and this is the part I want you to remember. Before I put a single seed into the ground, I fill that furrow with water and let the water soak down. I do not simply wet the surface after sowing and assume the job is finished. I want moisture waiting below the seed because August sun can dry the top layer surprisingly quickly. This small habit was shown to me many years ago, and it has stayed with me because it costs nothing and takes only a few extra minutes. Once the furrow has taken the water, I sow the seeds and cover them lightly with fine soil. Then I give the row another gentle watering if the surface needs it, but I avoid washing the seeds out of place. For lettuce and other small greens, I use the same basic approach. I prefer short rows rather than a whole bed because I am growing for the kitchen, not trying to fill a market stall. A little row can give us enough fresh leaves for several meals, and then another small row can follow a week later. This is where August becomes much more useful than people expect. You are not trying to force one giant harvest. You are creating a series of small harvests that arrive one after another. Roszponka is another good choice when the weather begins moving toward autumn. I like it because it fits naturally into the later part of the season and can remain useful as temperatures fall. The same goes for radishes, which are quick enough to reward you before the season is completely finished. Some root crops can also work when your local conditions give them enough time, but I always think about the actual weather where I live rather than blindly following a calendar. The important lesson is that the empty space left by one crop does not have to remain empty, and there is one mistake with moisture that can ruin even the best August sowing. There is another mistake I see quite often with August beds, and it has nothing to do with choosing the wrong vegetable. People sow the seeds correctly, the first little leaves appear, and then they become too confident and stop paying attention to the soil. I understand it, because once you see green coming up, it feels like the difficult part is finished. But those first few days are exactly when I keep checking the bed. A warm August wind can dry the surface surprisingly fast, and tiny seedlings do not have much protection from that. I learned not to follow a fixed watering schedule anymore. I look at the soil and respond to what I see. If the surface is beginning to dry while the seeds are still coming through, I give the row a gentle drink. I do not flood it, and I do not create a muddy bed. I just keep the moisture reasonably even until the plants are established. If the ground is already damp, I leave it alone. Most gardeners make the opposite mistake at this stage. They see a dry surface and immediately water heavily, then come back later and find that the soil has stayed too wet. Late crops need attention, but they do not need constant fussing. Another thing I learned is to stop trying to fill every empty inch of ground. When I first started using August sowings, an empty bed made me want to plant everything I had. That usually gave me too many seedlings in one place. Crowded plants compete for moisture and light, and later they become harder to thin and harvest. Now, I prefer a short, healthy row. I can see it clearly, keep it watered, and pick from it without disturbing the rest. This is especially useful with lettuce, spinach, and roszponka. I also like the old habit of using a very light covering over a freshly sown row when the weather is hot and dry. It can help slow moisture loss, but I keep it thin enough that the seedlings can emerge easily, and I can still see what is happening underneath. Once the young plants are established, the work becomes much easier. Then I start thinking about the part many people miss. I do not have to harvest the entire crop as soon as something reaches eating size. I can leave some plants in the ground and take only what I need, and that small change can make one August sowing feed the kitchen for much longer than you might expect. By the time the first cooler mornings arrive, this is when you finally understand why that little August sowing was worth doing. A bed that looked finished after cucumbers, peas, beans, or early potatoes can suddenly be giving you fresh food again, and I like that feeling because the work is simple by this stage. I walk through the garden, look at what is ready, and take only what I need. With spinach, I usually take the larger outer leaves and leave the center alone so the plant can continue growing. With lettuce, depending on the variety, I can take individual leaves instead of cutting the whole plant at once. Radishes are different because I pull them when the roots have reached a useful size, but even then I do not feel any need to clear every row on the same day. Roszponka is another one I like to leave in the garden because it can give me fresh leaves when many of the summer crops have already disappeared. This is where I think the second harvest becomes more than simply planting another vegetable. It changes the way you use the garden. Instead of having a strong beginning in spring, a busy summer, and then an empty garden waiting for winter, you create another smaller period of food production in autumn, and you can do it without buying much. If you already have seeds, some prepared soil, a little compost if the bed needs it, and a way to keep the seedbed moist, you already have most of what is required. I also appreciate that these crops do not demand the same kind of work as the big summer vegetables. There are no long cucumber vines to tie up, no heavy tomato plants to support, and no beans waiting for you every other day. You are simply keeping a few useful crops growing while the season changes. But I still follow one rule that has saved me from disappointment. I never assume that one successful sowing will feed us for the whole autumn. If there is enough space, I keep making small sowings with roughly a week between them while the weather remains suitable. That way, if one row struggles during a hot spell, another row is already coming along. More importantly, the harvest arrives gradually instead of giving me too much food at one time. This is the old habit I value most because it turns a late summer experiment into a system I can repeat every year. And once you see how much food can come from one bed before winter, you may start looking at every empty patch of soil in August a little differently. When I look back at the way I used to garden, I realize how many empty weeks I simply accepted because I thought the season had an ending written on the calendar. Now I see it differently. If a bed becomes empty in August, that is not necessarily the end of its work. It can be the beginning of another small harvest, and for me, that is one of the most satisfying parts of gardening. I clear the old cucumber vines, remove the finished peas or beans, take out the early potatoes, and instead of looking at bare soil, I ask myself what can still be grown before the cold weather arrives. I do not try to grow everything. I choose a few reliable crops such as spinach, lettuce, roszponka, radishes, and suitable root crops when there is enough time in my area. Then I keep the method simple. I prepare the soil, make the furrow, wet it properly before sowing, place the seeds, cover them lightly, and pay attention to moisture during those first important days. If the weather stays warm and dry, I check the row instead of trusting the calendar. If it needs water, I water it. If the soil is already moist, I leave it alone. That is really the old lesson I keep coming back to. The garden does not need more complicated products just because the season is changing. It needs us to notice what is happening and respond at the right time. I also keep sowing in small amounts, often with about a week between rows while the conditions remain suitable. That way, I am not suddenly faced with more spinach or lettuce than I can eat, and if one sowing has a difficult start, another one is already coming behind it. Then, when autumn arrives, I do not rush to clear everything. I take what I need and leave the rest growing as long as the conditions allow. A garden that still gives you something fresh in October feels very different from a garden that was abandoned in August. So the next time you pull out a summer crop and see an empty bed, do not immediately put the tools away. Look at that space for a moment and ask one simple question. What could I sow here now? Because sometimes the second harvest is already waiting in the ground, you just have to give it a chance.